Anyways, next up we've got the final movie for today's show, It Chapter 2. So 27 years after their first encounter with the terrifying Pennywise, the Losers Club have all grown up and they've all moved away. Well, except for one. But then one by one, they receive the devastating phone call to return home because, well, it's back. Now, the first chapter to this I really loved, and I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. And so I am a little disappointed in this one. I still think overall it's a pretty decent movie, but I think it's clearly not as good as that first chapter. And once again, I don't know if it's for the exact same reasons as the original miniseries as to why it doesn't work as well, but it's just something about these adult characters that is just less... It's less riveting than the children's story of all their encounters. And another part, I think, is that in the second chapter, we see more of what Pennywise is underneath, which I think the most interesting thing about Pennywise is his clown form, at least for me. I don't necessarily care too much about what he is underneath. So we see a lot more of him in a lot more situations where there's a lot of heavy CGI, and I don't know, it just doesn't do as much for me as the first movie does.
So this is a movie I saw about, I finished watching an hour before we started the show. It was an okay theater experience, but this movie, there's some things I'm trying to digest from it. There was some probably unnecessary additions that felt, I don't know, I don't think we needed some of this stuff. There's some things in this movie that I really enjoyed, and some other things that were not in the book, so they added some things that, were different, like hey, you have to find these totems before you can do this ritual, and I don't know, just... I almost had sort of like a video game feel to it. Like, hey, we have to find this before we can go on to the final boss. One thing I did like, this had some additional flashbacks from when they were kids that we didn't see in the first movie. And I pretty much liked all of those scenes, and somewhat ironically, I think those scenes were some of the best in the movie. When we get to see, them as kids again, especially like the whole clubhouse scene. I enjoyed that.
There's a number of different points to talk about here. So I think one of the things that they've done best for this movie is the casting for the movie. Pretty much everyone looks like a good older version of their younger self, with possibly, well, if I had to pick one that I didn't necessarily fully believe, is probably the one for Ben. I know, his character, he's lost all his weight and stuff, but I don't know. I don't buy that little porky fella turning into this, guy with chiseled abs. In the original 90s miniseries, we've got John Ritter playing that same type of character, and I think he's a little more believable as, a fat kid who is kind of, not... or has at least lost some weight, or slimmed down a little bit as an adult, but... I don't know. His character just seemed a little bit far-fetched. But outside of that, I think the way that the grown-up actors look, they just look like accurate representations of their younger characters.
Yeah, I think two of the best ones was probably obviously Richie and Bill Hader, and the guy who played Addie, which looks like James Ranson. I'm not really familiar with either one, but I thought both of those actors did really decent jobs, so I was happy with it.
I'd say probably Bill Hader had the best performance in the movie, or at least most enjoyable. But then again, that's a character of Richie. I think he has that leg up in terms of being more enjoyable because one is obviously that he's funny, and that when he gets to a point where he's trying to be, or he's showing all his emotions, it may hit you a little harder than the rest because you're just so used to seeing him be that fun-loving guy, and then
Yeah, I think that toward the end of the movie, where he's having sort of like a very emotional scene, such a, I think, a very heavy hitting scene, and everybody else is sort of happy and trying to be happy and smiling. This guy's just like crying, and that scene just hit me. It's a very well done scene.
Hmm. Another scene that I mentioned in my review, the suicide scene that we all know from in the miniseries, that particular scene is one of my favorites, and it didn't quite have the same impact this second time around. They didn't shoot it, in the exact same type of way. So, in the original, you've got the blood of it on the wall and the blood-curdling screams, and that scene in the original really gets to me, and yeah, that scene in this movie just is a bit disappointing that it didn't kind of do anything.
I think one of the reasons the 90s version works out maybe a bit better is because, if I recall, that was the ending of part one.
Yeah.
Because there's a miniseries, that was the end of part one, and it ends in such, everybody's getting the phone call, and this last guy to get the phone call, and then we see what happens to him, and that music in the background, and, like you say, the shrieking, like everything about it, it's just fantastic. And this one, and this may be a little reason for it giving toward the end, but it wasn't nearly as, I guess, well, shocking. I mean, pretty much, we are obviously Beverly saw it coming, so.
I mean, we've got this kind of running joke throughout the movie about Bill's endings always sucking, and I don't know exactly. Are they referencing something to do with Stephen King there, or are they referencing the original miniseries that it didn't end well, or?
There's a lot of critics who say that Stephen King can write a really good book until he gets to the ending, which, in my opinion, and speaking of which, keep eye out for the Stephen King cameo in the movie. It's pretty funny. But so yeah, a lot of people said about some of his books, and for some of them, you can sort of see why they might say that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of endings, I mean, this one probably has a better ending than the original miniseries, but I still don't think they nailed it. It just didn't have the impact that I was looking for.
Yeah, so this one thing I want to say about that, I've mentioned before, and I know that you've not read the book, but it's probably one of my favorite books. And the ending to that book, like the last 15 pages, it's just gut-wrenching. It's almost some of the saddest material I've ever read. And a movie, nothing I've seen has ever quite captured that. One thing I want to point out, there's a scene toward the end of this movie where Bill is writing his book. And that what he's writing on that page is actually a quote from the original Stephen King's It book. So I doubt that you necessarily had time to read the quote, but it was sort of nice to see a very direct reference to his book in the movie. So I enjoyed that.
I'm sure he enjoyed that too. This is a really long movie, almost 3 hours long,
and it's still too short.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't really actually notice the long runtime as I was watching it. It did kind of fly by pretty quickly for me, so I guess that at least indicates that the movie is still pretty decent.
Yeah, my one caveat, toward the end when this, like, they journey into the psychic cave of Pennywise, it gets a bit I think you used the term out there, and I think it's pretty accurate. It gets a bit strange at times. Some loses a bit of its, not necessarily coherency, but it doesn't feel quite as rooted in what we're used to, as the movie usually is. So that was, I mean, it wasn't a bad thing. It's just something that it's going to take a little getting used to, with new additions to this version of the story.
When I saw this at the theater, there was clearly a lot of people who loved the first movie, and well, there was even one woman dressed as Pennywise in the crowd. Pretty good costume she had on.
That's creepy.
Looked pretty much exactly like him in the movie, so she did a good job there. But anywho's, the fact that some of the crowd was even clapping at the credits, I was thinking, I think you're a little blinded by your love for that first movie, because I really don't think they nailed this movie. I think they did a decent job. It's an enjoyable second chapter to that movie, but it's I think it's very clearly not as good as the first chapter.
So there's about 6 things I want to say. One, I just remember because like I'm still trying to digest a lot of this. It's like almost a 3-hour movie, so there's a lot that you can forget. The way that they finally defeat Pennywise, and I don't feel like that's a spoiler because the poster literally says it ends. So, spoilers, Pennywise is defeated. The way they finally defeat him just felt sort of ridiculous to me. And a lot of people make their own choices, with that, but I don't know, it just I didn't care for that whatsoever.
No, I didn't really either.
Like at least in the 90s adaptation, which I will state the 90s adaptation is probably, at least in the finale, it's probably closer to the book than this one was. This one tried to throw in the ritual of Trod, or I think they pronounced it Trude, but it was done in a way that was sort of quite a bit different than the way the book uses it. So I don't know. It's interesting that the way they tried to adapt it here, but I don't know if it really worked entirely.
Yeah, and another thing is, I mean, me in terms of music, I thought the first chapter had really great music, and a lot of its returns in the sequel, like they chop it up and recycle it and put it back in this movie, but it just doesn't quite to have the same impact on the scenes. Also, yeah, the music just wasn't as enjoyable the second time around as it was in the first movie. You probably didn't notice too much about that.
I do remember. Now, there was one scene which had sort of like a comedic use of music. Like I can't remember for the life of me what that scene was, but it's like this like 3-second blast of music, and then it just goes on to the next scene. But I mean, otherwise, music was okay. I didn't have any big problem with it. Just another random thing. I did appreciate seeing the Paul Bunyan statue coming after Richie. That was something that was in the books that obviously the 90s adaptation didn't do, because 90s adaptation didn't have the budget for it. And though I agree that a lot of the CGI in this movie was a bit iffy, I was actually okay with that sequence.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think they could have done it any other way to begin with, but I actually think that sequence, aside from the somewhat strange singing and dancing, but I don't know. Aside from that, I sort of enjoyed the scene Paul Bunyan coming after Richie. I had good times.
Yeah. Well, I think in the first chapter, like I was saying earlier, there's Pennywise is, he's really what people. I think the majority of people want to see. Like, they don't necessarily want to see him turn into this creature or whatever. Well, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's just me. And in the original movie, we see a lot of Pennywise, and he tends to take the form of the clown in most, not all the time, but most of the screen time in the first chapter. And in this one, there's really only, just off the top of my head, and there's probably maybe one or two more, but there's really only 2 standout scenes that I can recall off the top of my head with Pennywise in this movie. One being in the initial opening sequence, and where he attacks someone, and then later on that what was it, a firefly or something?
Yes.
That scene there. But outside of those 2, it didn't feel like he was in the movie all that much. Or well, he was, but he was taking forms of all these other different, generic creature type things, and yeah, it's just kind of disappointing that you don't see him as much.
I did enjoy, actually, just to mention 2 things. I really like the opening scene. The opening scene to this movie was one of the earliest scenes in the books also, so it's nice to see them finally sort of bring that to life. And it happened mostly the same way in the book as it did here, so it was sort of nice to see. And this scene was new. This scene wasn't in the books, but that scene, the flashback with Ban and Beverly at the school. I guess it was like a summer school type thing. I thought that was not necessarily a standout scene, but I thought it was pretty interesting. And I sort of enjoyed like the shadow on the projector, and it's just Beverly, and well, you see what happens. But I know I sort of enjoyed that. I think the most random one off the top of my head was probably the whole thing with Artie and the basement of the pharmacy. Like that scene was just sort of, it was okay, but it just seemed so strange to me. They probably could have done that a bit better, just changed it or something. I didn't care too much for that sequence. I also sort of I sort of like how like crazy Mike, he's, hey guys, you've got to like listen to me and stand. Like everybody's, dude, we're just leaving. I felt bad for the guy during those scenes.
Yeah, I thought this movie was a little messy though, in terms of just they have to go do this. Okay, now we have to go do this. Like, we see Bill go kind of retrieve that boat and the boat that he made for Georgie, and then later on he's like, oh, now I gotta go to this fair and save this random kid. And
well, I mean, obviously I feel like the kid just reminded him of George, so that's probably why he...
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just seemed like, I don't know, it's just kind of going through the motions. Let's find a way to put this in the movie. And
that actually reminds me of something. The whole subplot with Henry Bowers, I thought it started out good, but then like it was pretty much, I don't know, pointless. He didn't honestly do that much to impact anything. Like in the original, and in the book, he puts Mike in the hospital. But here, he like fights a bit with Addie, fights a bit with Mike, but both of them are perfectly fine to go down to the, I don't know, he seemed almost pretty pointless, to be honest.
Well, the weird thing about the crowd in the theater was that, man, they were laughing uncontrollably at that scene where Bowers is attacking Eddie. I'm like, I know there's a couple of like things to maybe giggle at in the movie, but they were just like laughing like it's a comedy movie. I'm like, what is wrong with these people?
I'm very happy I did not see this movie with your crowd.
Yeah. Like, it just felt like they were a little too blinded by their love or wanting to love the movie, that they just had to laugh at everything. And, like I said, some of them gave it a standing ovation at the end. I'm like, this is not a 10 out of 10 movie. I didn't feel the need to, get up and clap.
This movie is a movie that I'm still in the process of trying to digest. There's still a lot of things I'm thinking about. There's quite a few big changes from the book and the original 90s adaptation that I need to consider. I'm not sure how much I like some of it, but then again, some of it was very, almost sort of brave what they changed. So, for the time being, I'm just going to give this a 7, which is an average rating, and that may go up or down the more I think about this movie. So maybe, next week it might finally amount to like an 8. But for now, I feel like a 7 is okay. And that's all I have.
And you gave Chapter 1 an 8 out of 10, didn't you?
Either an 8 or an 8.5, I forget.
But it was higher rating than this one.
Yes.
Yeah. So for now, you're saying, okay, Chapter 1 was still better.
Yeah, and actually, that just reminds me of one thing. There was one scene I neglected to mention that I thought was really funny. The scene when the adults get to the clubhouse, when Richie makes sort of like a joke, Pennywise type joke, and like everybody's like, "Dude, what the fuck are you doing?" And I really like you say, he's really a standout in this movie, and the guy just consistently cracked me up. But yeah, the best parts of this movie, in my opinion, were probably when the flashbacks when they were kids. That's when I had the most fun, and obviously the first movie did that a lot more than this one did.
And the scene where he was swearing at that kid as they're leaving the restaurant. It's like, fuck you!
I felt bad for that kid. Well, actually, I felt worse for the parents, to be honest.
You want a picture with me? Anywho, yeah, no, I'm giving this one for now an 8 out of 10. Like you said, it may take a little time to digest, and who knows, maybe a year or two later down the line we think a little differently of it. But the first chapter, I saw that 3 times in the theater, and this one I don't have the urge to actually go see this again in the theater. So I think it's quite clearly for me nowhere near as good as that first chapter, and even I would say IMDb is indicating rather quickly that there's a lot more mixed feelings about this one than the first chapter. Because the first day the ratings, or the first day you were able to rate this movie on IMDb, I first noticed it was like an 8.2 or something out of 10. It was 8 point something out of 10. And now, 3-4 days later, it's already dropped to below what Chapter 1 has. And it's down to a 7.3. And Chapter 1's got a 7.4. And it's only going to go more and more down. So I think that's another indication that this second chapter didn't quite nail it.
Which is really disappointing, given obviously the fact that they really had an opportunity to do this when what the 90s version could do. And I would say that this is probably better than the adult portion of the 90s miniseries, but even that's somewhat questionable in my opinion, which shows how mixed I sort of find the whole movie.
Yeah, and I think when you think about it, this new version, both movies combined, Chapter 1 and 2, is well over 5 hours worth of runtime there between both of them. And the original miniseries is, less than 3 hours or thereabouts, so about half the amount of time. So they clearly had the extra time to put more into it, and yeah, like I said, they just didn't nail this one, and which is a little disappointing, but I think Chapter 1 is... I'll keep going back to watch that one, but I don't know how often I'll go back to watch this one.
I mean, the more I think about it, the way that they end up defeating Pennywise, I'm surprised cast audiences liked that, and I'm just surprised that was what they went with. It just feels almost so weak to me. Like, I don't know, just that part more than anything just sort of bothers me.
So now when they reference, bad endings, they can kind of attribute it to this one as well.